Hello, I'm Richard Murphy, and I want to talk about an issue which many people who view this video series will know I'm concerned about, and that is the national debt. Now, the simple facts that we need to know at present are that the national debt in March this year, at the time that the government put forward its budget for the year 2020-21, was something like, in terms of actual debt, £1.8 trillion. And they forecast that the cost of the interest to be paid on that sum would be around £56 billion. And so we're talking about an interest rate that is just over 3% forecast for that year. Now, of course, every forecast for 2021 has gone out of the window because of coronavirus, but that's still a very important benchmark for what I'm going to be talking about. Remember that interest rate, just over 3% on average on the national debt. And now let's discuss some other aspects of that. First of all, a little over 20%, but under 25%, so somewhere around 22% of that national debt was owned by the government because of quantitative easing. What did that mean? Well, roughly £12 billion or so of the interest to be paid out of that £56 billion total would come straight back to the government as a consequence, because the government was literally paying itself. So the actual real cost of debt was going to be around £44 billion, somewhat less than the figure actually included in the budget, which was deliberately misleading because that's part of the government's austerity narrative. But what has happened since? Well, let's be clear what's happened since. What's actually happened is that the national debt has gone up round about £400 billion. Maybe a little bit of that still to go, but over the course of the year it will go up by around £400 billion. But the amount of quantitative easing has gone up by almost exactly the same amount, and so the real increase in the national debt comes down to, well, virtually nothing. In fact, as I was told recently by quite a senior government official, every time the government issues debt at present, the national debt goes down. Now, there are technical reasons for that, but it's actually true. But more important, the amount of debt that the government owns at its original issue cost price has gone up from something close to £400 billion to something close to £800 billion. Near enough, the amount of quantitative easing gilts owned by the government has doubled this year. Now, what's the consequence of that? That means that whatever the issue price for all new debt this year, the actual real price that will be paid will be 0.1%. And that's because that's the Bank of England's base rate. And that's the interest rate that it will pay to the UK's commercial banks who are now owed money in place of the national debt. And that's for a very simple reason. They receive the payments from the government for the purchase of those gilts. And as a result, they hold the resulting deposits on their balance sheets and they're paid 0.1% on them. And the gilts are effectively cancelled. Now, let's just run through the consequence of that. Think about it. We now have something like £800 billion worth of debt on the government balance sheet. 400 billion of that at least was costing over 12 billion a year. The debt issued this year would be less, but actually the debt issued this year is not necessarily the debt that has been repurchased. So let's carry on assuming a 3% interest rate. Something like £24 billion of debt charge may, as a consequence, be cancelled this year. In place of that 24 billion, which actually cannot be paid because it returns straight to the Treasury the moment that it is settled, and therefore the net cost is nothing, there's paid in its place 0.1% on £800 billion. And 0.1% of £800 billion is £800 million. So what's actually happened this year as a result of extra QE is that instead of something in excess of £20 billion and maybe as high as £24 billion being paid in debt interest, just less than £1 billion will be paid instead. In other words, £23 billion or so of interest charge may be cancelled as a consequence of quantitative easing this year. Now, I stress these numbers will be open to adjustment because the precise figures aren't known by me, aren't known by the Office for National Statistics, and aren't known by the Treasury as yet. But they are good indications of the scale of the numbers we're talking about. Quantitative easing is massively reducing the cost of the national debt. But despite that, I hear from people concerned that what happens if interest rates rise and there's all this money out there still owing to commercial banks? Well, all that money is short-term borrowing. The money in question is held literally on current accounts to which interest is added. That's the nature of central bank reserve accounts. They are very short-term money. And who sets the short-term interest rate in the UK? Well, the Bank of England does. Who do they set it on behalf of? The government. Would they ever set an interest rate which was significantly out of line with that which a chancellor wanted? No, I can promise you they won't, because any chancellor has the chance to overrule, in the end of the day, any interest rate that the Bank of England sets. And so much for Bank of England independence goes that. There is provision in law that they can be overruled if necessary. Now, what then follows on from this? Suppose the interest rate does rise. Suppose the government decided that the interest rate should rise, in other words, because that's the only way it could go up. It doesn't go up for any other reason. Long-term interest rates can go up because of market pressure, but short-term interest rates won't. If that short-term interest rate went up to, say, 0.5%, which is the maximum that the Office for Budget Responsibility think it will go up to by the middle of this decade, i.e. over the next 5 years, instead of paying £800 million a year for the cost of servicing that debt to banks, the cost would go up to, let's be clear, £4 billion. But there would still be a saving of some £20 billion as a consequence compared to the price of that debt if it was still outstanding as gilts. So the point is that the debt interest rate on short-term borrowing has to actually go up to around 3% before we begin to lose out as a consequence of QE. Is there any chance at all that anybody thinks that the interest rate in the UK will go up to 3% over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years or beyond? I actually frankly think the chance is incredibly low indeed. This rate has not been seen now for over a decade. The long-term trend in interest rates has been downwards. There is no pressure anywhere in the world for rates to rise at present. There's no reason for the UK to choose to increase its rates at present. And there's no reason that it would need to do so even if Brexit was a disaster, because you cannot compensate for Brexit disaster by increasing the interest rate. People would just devalue the pound instead. And so as a consequence, this price is almost certainly locked in. And there's a very good social reason for that. The government doesn't want mortgage rates to increase because it knows that households couldn't afford them. The result is we are simply not going to see that cost of borrowing rise. QE has permanently reduced the cost of borrowing. Whatever else it might have done, this interest rate is here to stay, and it represents a substantial saving over what we've had already. And that's good news for the UK economy in the long term, and it's good news for UK borrowers in the long term, because their interest rate is going to remain low because the government shares their concern that low interest rates are what they want. This is not a problem to worry about.
Thanks for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, I'm pleased. If you want to see other videos like this, there are links below this screen. If you want to subscribe, hit the subscribe button. Follow me on Twitter as well, @RichardJMurphy. Look at my blog, Tax Research UK. And if you'd like to donate, because this video series is being largely paid for by donations, there is a donations button on every single post on my blog. Thanks a lot.